What's this? I have to rebuild my base space because it was fucked. Absolutely fucked. First thing first, I need titanium. Okay, I don't need. I guess I can put this. No, can put this here. So I survived the boss, which means all I have to do now is just get an insane amount of titanium and go for end game build. Some diamond here and there. This is still the 40 iron run, pretty much. One thing is for sure, I'm not gonna fucking. I'm gonna go with 40 cement. Maybe 20 actually. It's hard to say. We'll see how it goes. Ilyen messzire még nem jutottam el. Szóval nem tudom, hogy milyen ellenfelek fognak jönni. De a boss a legutóbb kinyílt. Eight days, 8 days, 8 days, 8 days, 8 days. Everything in 8 days. So these are locked out. I can only choose between these. 5, 7, 8. 8. I don't need that, that's for sure. I might need technology. Yeah, because I need a lot of technology for the railguns. Oh, it's like a little face poking out. Yeah, that's the same. It's just some shady figure poking out from behind it. And this is like, hey, I'm playing with my dolls here, leave me alone. Nope, nope, I'm gonna fuck you up. Yeah, pretty much. I think I will have enough option to try to kill him. And even if I can't, I'm probably gonna survive it. 3 days of okay, I have to kill him, I guess. 0.8, I don't know. So I cannot go here because that will lock me into this one. So that's out of the question. So the question is, these are identical. It's just the souls are different. This is preferable because it's a speed soul, but the mining soul is also good. Beard soul, that's construction and repair. Nah. And I don't know what these are, so double technology looks good though. I could easily max out, get everything I want. And it doesn't have iron on it, which I probably won't need anyways. So looks like choose a soul and just go double technology. I guess I can come here because that would give me an option between these two paths. Coming here wouldn't give me options, so I definitely go here and see which one is better. Yeah, I cannot go there. So it's gonna be this. And they're all of them 8 days, right? Everything in 8 days. Even this, everything 8 days. That's a lot of days. So I have 57, 47, up until 47. I guess I can get back some of these because I won't need them anymore. I should be able to find enough titanium here to make at least one shield. So these are all useless pretty much. Thing is, I'm a bit afraid. If I demolish while they're not repaired, I think they give back less stuff. That's my guess. Can definitely demolish this, all of this. I guess I should do like this, so it doesn't break up. Can turn these off, I don't need them. I won't need the lights right now either. It's stupid how 2 lanes of 3 just kept everyone fed. Crazy. and stuff. So I got back the. No, I didn't dissolve them, but I did fully run out of bullets. So I can just build them. Demolish these. These. Need a new eye there. Demolish that. Man, I lost a lot of shit. But the what I actually need, I still have, so it's fine. Higher power of the mill to keep churning out stuff I need. Probably have enough iron for a second mill as well. Stone, yeah, I should have enough stone as well. For the second mill. There's no stone on this map, right? Yeah, it's absolutely absent. So that's all the stone I have. It's just enough for another mill. Which is incredible that I managed to save enough stone. Even though I made a lot of bullets. Okay. I should be able to go to rockets. Does anything need stone? Nope. Nothing. Nothing that I want to build. Furnace and that's it. I guess bombs need stone. Do I still have the table? It is. So nothing needs stone. That's good. And because because of that, I cannot build a stone building. I have to use something else. Do I have wood? I have wood. I have a shit ton of wood. Okay, so first thing first, we need this back. Renewable farming. Need this wheat now. Oh, I need stone to rebuild the food production. Shit. Suppose I'm gonna get back. Yeah, I might need to stick to corn until I manage to get some stone back. Just use the wood I have right now. Okay. I mean, technically, when I get off from coal, I get some stone back. I can finish the garden. So 9 6 hours, right? 2 times 2 times 3. Do the double furnace here, I guess. Okay, I don't need the limestone, right? Yeah, I get back some stone from that. Yeah, I don't need because my building won't be much bigger than what it is now. It's gonna pretty much stay the same size. Wait. This here. Wood on the right. This comes here. What the hell is that? So what I don't need is these. Don't need these either. Yeah, I don't wanna risk it. I have enough board. No. It's actually a lot of resources. I'm gonna demolish this and see what's going. It's not that big of a deal to lose the resources there. One diamond, 7 wood, 10 iron, 20 iron. Yeah, I get back exactly half. Okay. I need furnace. As soon as possible. Coal, I have plenty of coal. There are the mining. I need to go straight for the titanium. The titanium as soon as possible.
If you're going to commit to
For the Dark Angels, yeah, shot in the dark, but hey, you never know your luck. Might as well try. Regardless, power armor had now been well and truly secured. In addition, Lord Hector Rex would be bringing along with him 38 Inquisitors. This force was made up of the Lord Inquisitor's supporters and previous apprentices. Amongst the number would also come Hector Rex's own mentor, the venerable Lord Thor Malkin, a previous protected
it's not
general of the
human.
Skara sector.
Max
The old
production.
man was, by all
not
accounts,
construction.
ancient at this point in his career, and this was likely to
could
be
have
his
a-
last campaign. But whilst his body may have turned fragile over the years, his mind was still sharp. And no one in the
Wonder, do
entire
I
Skara
actually need
sector
it?
knew more about demons and
No,
their
no, no. I
infernal
might die in
than
hunger
him.
if I try
And
something
along with the
fancy right now.
Inquisitors and the mandate from the Conclave of
But
Scaras,
I do have to
Lord Hector
fix
and all
this.
his following Inquisitors had access to all of the resources of the Scaras sector's inquisitorial forces. That, of course, meant that they could call upon a regiment's worth of inquisitorial stormtroopers if the need presented itself, as well as full access to the agents of the Officio Assassinorum. As for the division and deployment of these forces and the Inquisitors themselves, however, that might quickly become a bit more of a complicated situation. Fortunately, Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex was the Protector General. Thusly, he had authority to order the lesser Inquisitors about a bit, and so there was at least the vague outlines of a command structure. But by and large, the close to 40 Inquisitors would be divided up amongst the various siege regiments' headquarters, and they would have full authority to do whatever they wanted to do with the forces at their command. And if they wished to involve further troops, they would have to consult with the other inquisitorial agents on planet as well. Essentially, this created a secondary system of command, which superseded the already in existence Imperial command structure. This could very easily become a bit of a recipe for disaster. Inquisitors tend to, and indeed have to, be very independent people. They are used to taking decisions without consulting with anyone else, and making snap decisions at that. Now, however, they would have to operate on a far larger battlefield, where one's individual forces may not always be sufficient, necessitating, obviously, a certain degree of cooperation. But it can be difficult to get dozens of highly individualistic people to cooperate with one another, especially as many of these Inquisitors, whilst hailing from more or less the same belief system and school of operation, may still have wildly different interpretations of any given situation. And since there was only one overall authority with the power to issue blanket orders to several formations and Inquisitors at once, that could quite easily lead to some serious roadblocks, where the various Inquisitors may, for one reason or another, refuse to cooperate with each other. The old saying, "too many cooks in the kitchen spoils the soup," could very, very easily come into play. But of course, it could also be to the army's benefit. Now, every single regiment would have access to a shot caller, somebody that could mobilize the full resources and the reserves of the regiment at the drop of a hat, and could also draw in additional reinforcements from the inquisitorial reserves. This gave each regiment a much greater degree of action and maneuver than they had enjoyed previously, where they in many cases had been somewhat hidebound by high command. And in warfare, a quick decision swiftly reached is often better than a perfect one reached after hours of deliberation. The potential was, of course, also for the various Inquisitors to get in one another's way as they reacted to the same situation, but, well, Hector Rex would simply have to try and rein in the worst excesses of his subordinates until he could figure out which Inquisitors would work well alongside one another. As for the existing command structure of the 88th Army, it would by and large be allowed to remain intact. The only change would be to the absolute uppermost echelons of the 88's command structure. That, of course, being Marshal Arnim Kagori and his personal command staff. Now that Hector Rex had assumed supreme command of the army, the Marshal either had to step down and await a further command to be handed to him by the Adeptus Munitorum, or he would have to submit himself to the authority of the Inquisition and transition from being the army's commander to being just one of its commanders. As far as the Marshal was concerned, the decision was simple enough. He had come to lead the 88th Imperial Guard siege army to victory on Vrax, and if he could not lead it, then at the very least he would fight alongside his army until that final victory had been achieved. He offered to take command of one of the regiments, or even to take up a command of an individual company, if the Lord Inquisitor would allow him. On his part, Lord Hector Rex had nothing against Arnim Kagori. The Lord Inquisitor was of the opinion that the Marshal had done everything in his power, and the simple fact that it was no longer within his power to win the war was not his fault. And so he would allow the Marshal to travel to Vrax and take part in the combat directly as a regimental commander. He also authorized several members of Kagori's command staff to join their now quite beloved commander on the planet of Vrax. And with the somewhat distasteful task of relieving Arnim Kagori of his overall command of the army, Hector Rex now stood free to move his own command staff into the recently vacated headquarters on Thracian Primaris, and begin issuing his own orders to the 88th Imperial Guard Siege Army, which now officially became part of the Ordo Malus. As for the reality on the ground for the Guardsmen and the individual commanders, not a whole lot had really changed. The biggest difference was that now their orders came directly from the Inquisition, sealed in a special envelope with an inquisitorial eye emblazoned on the front of it. The biggest challenge for the Death Corps in all due likelihood would be getting along with their new friends. The various Inquisitors, now entrenched in the regimental headquarters, all brought along with them their own retinues of often highly unique characters. Personalities that were often quite at odds with the more dour outlook of the Death Corps' officers. In addition, there would also be the odd Officio Assassinorum operative or stormtrooper officer butting in on the Death Corps' nice and Spartan command centers. Hopefully there weren't any overly flamboyant characters, otherwise the rate of firearms accidents on Vrax might see a sharp uptick. But that was a problem for another day. The first priority was to secure the swift and immediate victory that Lord Hector Rex required to solidify his position in charge of the 88th Siege Army. This would be carried out by taking over an operation already planned for by Marshal Kagori. In the current situation, the 88th had almost completed another full surround of the Vraxian defenders. However, on the rightmost flank, the 30th Line Corps' forward momentum had been halted by the worshippers of Nurgle. And so, the Lord Inquisitor's first operation would be to break open this deadlock and complete the encirclement of the Citadel walls. And if everything went to plan, there might even be an opportunity to overrun the southern edges of the easternmost Citadel walls, which would in turn leave the main Vraxian citadel dangerously exposed to an attack from the south. The Lord Inquisitor and his staff agreed that this was an optimistic possibility, but they also felt confident that they could carry out the operation to the utmost of their ability. And since the Grey Knight strike cruiser had already arrived in system, they felt confident that, albeit optimistic, it was an entirely reasonable goal. This goes a long way to show that for all his forward thinking, planning, and understanding of the threat at hand, the Lord Inquisitor was still very new to the Vraxian theatre, and how it tended to treat optimistic estimates. But I am sure the planet will be more than willing to teach its lesson soon enough. For now, let's have a look at the Lord Inquisitor's plan. The 30th Line Corps would make up the main assault force, deploying all 4 of its siege regiments, the 263rd, 262nd, 269th, and 261st, in the main force. Additionally, the 7th and 11th Tank Regiments would be seconded to the 30th Line Corps for the duration of the offensive. Together, these troops would sweep southwards and clean up all of the Nurgle worshippers from the easternmost pocket, ending the resistance of the Chaos forces in the area and completing the surround of the Curtain Walls. And finally, the 308th Regiment of the 34th Line Corps would push southwards from the breach, claiming the southmost portions of the westernmost curtain wall, and then begin moving eastwards towards the now claimed territories of the 30th Line Corps. And this is where the optimism comes into play. Not only was the 308th Regiment expected to push southwards and oust the enemy from the southernmost tip of the western curtain walls, they were also then expected to push across the southernmost border of the inner Vraxian Citadel area and join up with the 30th Line Corps on the other end. This would see the 308th cross a distance longer than that expected of the 269th Siege Regiment of the 30th Line Corps, and the 308th did not have the benefit of armor, Inquisitor, or Astartes support. Undoubtedly, the Lord Inquisitor expected that since the Vraxian forces in the south were essentially isolated and in an exposed position, they would perhaps fold easily, surrender maybe even, and so the 308th would have no problems clearing them up. And afterwards, all they would have to do was cross an open area, right? It's not like the Vraxians had a long and proud history of massive, overwhelming, devastating counterattacks or anything. Of course not. It would all be entirely fine. Besides, it wasn't like the 30th Line Corps wouldn't be there to help them a little bit if they needed it. All they would have to do is crush a large area filled to the brim with Nurgle worshippers, after which they'd have to then assault the outer curtain walls to join up with 308th. Again, the Lord Inquisitor undoubtedly expected the enemy to simply abandon these positions if threatened from multiple positions. Of course, that's again based upon the assumption that they would be another threat from the 308th, and that the 30th would even make it there in the first place. Now, to be sure, this confidence was not entirely misplaced or plucked out of thin air. The 30th Line Corps had a full 4 siege regiments, supported by 2 armored regiments. Additionally, it would also have the support of Inquisitors in the field, along with their agents and stormtrooper elements, potentially even Officio Assassinorum support, and high above in orbit hung the Grey Knight strike cruiser, the Honor Amentum. Being specially equipped to carry out the duties of the Grey Knights, it contained within it several teleportarum chambers, allowing the venerable old vessel to deploy several squads of Grey Knights anywhere on the battlefield within a moment's notice. This would allow the Grey Knights under the command of Brother Captain Stern to instantaneously respond to any demonic threat or to break open particularly entrenched centers of enemy resistance. Or if the unimaginable were to happen and the 30th in some way, shape or form might get in over its head, the Grey Knights could undoubtedly bail them out, toot sweet. But still, there had been several commanders before Lord Hector Rex that had also been of the opinion that they had access to invincible numbers, undeniable firepower, and an unstoppable forward momentum. And Vrax had proved every single one of those commanders painfully wrong. And unfortunately, Lord Hector apparently was heading towards that very same fate. Overconfidence might just be his downfall, because not only was he planning for this major operation with the 30th Line Corps, he was also preparing 2 further offensives upon the successful conclusion of the 30th's attack. This would be a very clear case of counting one's chicken before they've hatched. And the first of these chickens would be the 1st Line Corps, who, with 3 siege regiments, would push forward up to the curtain walls, destroying any further outlying pockets of resistance between it and the curtain walls. The first was then to move into new positions, digging out trenches, bunkers and artillery positions, before preparing for an eventual assault upon the curtain walls. This operation was a bold and decisive one if it succeeded, or a foolhardy one if it failed, since its forward momentum relied entirely upon the 30th Line Corps being there to secure the 1st Line Corps' flanks. If the 30th was not there, then a full 75% of the 1st Line Corps' forces would be dedicated to a major frontal assault towards the citadel walls, which would leave only a single siege regiment to resist any potential flank assaults made upon it by the Nurgle forces in the pocket. And to make things even more risky, the 46th Line Corps would also carry out a similar operation towards the curtain walls, aiming to seize a strategic high point known as Hill 202 and then fortify it. Hill 202 being one of the most heavily fortified positions remaining outside of the curtain walls. The more observant amongst you may already have spotted the problem with all of this. If the 30th Line Corps is to be fully committed to pushing the enemy in the east, and 75% of the 1st Line Corps is to be committed to pushing up against the curtain walls, and the full might of the 46th is also to be committed, where are the reserves? And the simple answer to that is, there were none. If the 30th Line Corps' forward momentum was to be stymied, or God Emperor help us all, reversed, then the 1st Line Corps' extreme flank would be left virtually completely undefended. The only thing that would stand in the way of a rapid riposte launched by the fetid followers of the Plague God would be a single siege regiment. And if it were to be overrun, the 1st Line Corps might find itself surrounded, with the Vraxian defenders to their front and the Plague God's followers running rampant in their rear. The Lord Inquisitor was clearly impatient and wished to push the war to a successful conclusion quickly before the worst-case scenario could become a problem. But in so doing, he was taking an awful risk. And he had better hope that his reinforcements were as good as he thought they were, because if his fellow Inquisitors and extra resources were not enough to guarantee the success of the 30th Line Corps, it might end very poorly indeed for the 1st. Whether or not the Lord Inquisitor had overplayed his hands, we will find out in the next episode. Until then, I have been Arch.
Wherever you find...
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. where today, somewhat unusually, we are not going to the battlefront. Neither to the core word assault or the primary assault. Instead, we are going way back in the Sabbat worlds, to a planet touched by the Imperial Crusade many, many years ago. We are going back to Balhut. The site, of course, of the Imperium's perhaps single greatest victory so far in the Crusade, the Turning Point, where a stalled Imperial Crusade was transformed and reinvigorated yet again into a glorious pursuit of what everyone expected to be a defeated enemy. That, of course, didn't quite work out the way that the Imperium had hoped for, but nevertheless, or perhaps despite of this fact, Balhut held a place of particular significance in the heart of the Imperial Crusade, being both the battlefield where the infernal Archon of the arch-enemy Nadzibar was finally brought to justice and righteously dispatched by the victorious arms of the God Emperor, but also the final resting place of the visionary who had made the crusade possible in the first place, War Master Sladeau. Due to this dual significance, and the crusade going on for longer than many had hoped and anticipated, Balhut had become an important world for different reasons than merely the strategic. It had become a touchstone, a place of memorial and reverence. Nobles from the Khan worlds would flock to Balhut to see the final resting place of War Master Sladeau, the savior of their own system, and a creature of almost mythological significance to the Khan group. Many others came to visit the graves of lost loved ones, as the Khan groups had been a large central rallying point for the creation of many Imperial Guard regiments that would follow Sladeau into the Sabbat worlds. Many others came from yet further afield, having followed in the footstep of a prominent relative. Perhaps distant nobility had an uncle or a cousin serving as an officer in one of the countless Imperial Guard regiments that invaded the Sabbat worlds. Having such a hero in the family would of course impart great gravitas upon the rest of the familiar lineage. Being seen to be closer, therefore, to such a heroic figure would no doubt be great help in local politics. Yet others again simply ventured to Balhut because it was the site of a great Imperial victory, wanting to see the sights and experience the world for themselves. Not to mention, of course, billions upon billions of pilgrims streaming into the Sabbat worlds after the news of the resurrected saint became more commonly known in the rest of the Imperium, passing through the planet rather than stopping on it. And then there were the dead, arriving on Balhut by their uncountable trillions. The world had not merely become the final resting spot, you see, for those who fell in its liberation. Due to the world's significance and its particular history, it had become a popular final destination for many officers and men of means or accomplishment who had fallen in the God Emperor's service in the Sabbat worlds, being transported back at significant expense to be interned into enormous mausoleums, many of which were even now still being built or in the process of being constructed or planned out, as Balhut was slowly turning into a bit of a mortuary world, where the caring for the dead or the preparation for their arrival was a swiftly growing industry amongst its population. And of course, there were also many, 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 many more less deserving soldiers that were to be buried in the hallowed earth of Balhut as well. Those who were not of a higher class and who could not afford such luxury either by themselves or from their family's side, but who would instead be granted at least the small mercy of being interned in vast military cemeteries, or occasionally, if, for example, only pieces of the deceased could be discovered, in huge communal tombs, mass graves with a little bit of extra frill to make the practice a pinch more palatable. But it wasn't just the dead who were returning to Balhut. Due to its strategic position at the heart of many a stable warp route, the world had once been a central hub of administration for the Sabbat worlds, before they had fallen to chaos. And now that a significant portion of those very self-same worlds had been reconquered by the Imperium, Balhut was yet again resuming its duties as a center for travel, for rest and recuperation, for Imperial intelligence, and the armies of bureaucrats that always follow in the God Empress soldiers' footsteps. It was the R&R part, the rest and relaxation bit, that saw the Tarnith first and only arrive on Balhut for the first time. As, of course, pretty much everyone in the regiment had never been there before, with a handful of exceptions such as Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, who had been a part of the original invasion force alongside the Hirken 8th. The Colonel Commissar's reward for his heroics that day was supposed to be the command of several regiments of Tarnith. But, well, due to the intervention of a Chaos raiding force, he barely got out with one overstrength regiment, which had since been through the meat grinder more than once. And despite reinforcements both on Verghast and later on Anachron Sextus, the regiment had taken a beating again and again and again. And the worst of all of these beatings had happened just recently on a planet by the name of Jago, a particularly cursed world where the Tarnith First and Only had been sent up into a large mountain range to occupy a series of pre-Imperium fortifications. They had been dispatched to do this under the orders of Van Voigt, who, well, didn't tell the Tarnith the complete story as to why they were sent up into the mountains. They were originally informed that they would be carrying out scouting duties, occupying a position just in case the archenemy decided on some kind of a flanking move. Entirely unlikely, of course, but just in case. Van Voigt had been underselling things somewhat. A lot, in fact. His own armies were engaged in a desperate all-out struggle with the primary strength of the arch-enemy's forces on the planet, and his flank was hanging in thin air, completely unprotected and with virtually no reserves whatsoever to speak of. If the arch-enemy swung around the mountain chain and struck Van Voigt and his men from that direction, his army was as good as doomed. And that's why he placed the Tarnith on his flank. They had by now developed quite the reputation for being able to pull off the kind of miracles that nobody else would be expected to do. Furthermore, they were not really a main frontline formation. They would be ill at ease in the hammering, battering tank melee of the main front, but occupying positions on the crucial flank of the main army, where they might not run into anything, well, It was a perfect situation as far as Von Voigt was concerned. If they didn't find anything, then he'd only sent off 2,000 to 3,000 light infantry, of little use in the main clash anyways. And if they did run into something, it was likely to be one hell of a something. The kind of something that only a regiment like the Tarnith were likely to be able to hold off. And of course, there was indeed something coming. An enormous blood-packed force, as the archenemy had apparently lured Von Voigt onto their main strength, intending to sideswipe him and eradicate him with a vast flanking formation. And the Tarnith were indeed just the right regiment to occupy a position called Hinsa House, the house at the end of the world, as the Tarnith described it, and block the advance of the Blood Pact. Fortunately, this was not their final battle, although it very easily could have been. The Blood Pact formation was far too large to be properly stopped by the Tarnith, who did not even have access to the resupply required to keep themselves combat operational. They didn't have enough munitions, they didn't have enough food, nor enough water, and by the time additional support could be reserved and rallied to them, the Blood Pact had already managed to surround the fortress that the Tarnith were now occupying, making it virtually impossible for them to receive the resupplies of ammunition and water. The entire regiment was eventually reduced to fighting with bayonets, knives, and bludgeons rather than lasguns. And as the last dregs of their ammunition reserves were depleted, it was only through a stroke of luck and genius that they managed to discover a cache of locally produced weapons and their ammunition. We shan't call them Xenos weapons and ammunition, because if we did, then that, of course, would impugn the honor of the Tarnith first and only. No. They merely rediscovered a lost cache of, exotic wall guns, yes, that aided them in holding off the Blood Pact assault for just long enough for the Kanagas 52nd Mechanized, a full major force of 20,000 men, to reach them through the mountain passes and assume positions within Hinsa House and its surrounding terrain to block and bloodily repulse the Blood Pact force. But before their arrival, of course, the Tarnith had to stand alone against the enemy, suffering severe casualties, including, it was thought for a very long time, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt himself, who had been taken by the enemy during one of their countless storms of the Hinsa House fortifications. He had been dragged away for interrogation, torture, and undoubtedly execution. The command of the Tarnith first and only fell to Major Ron, who was now the second in command of the regiment after the passing of Colm Korbeck quite some whilst ago. However, Gaunt was not actually dead, and due to the heroic efforts of Scout Sergeant McCall and Gaunt's bodyguard, I suppose, life ward Ezra Knight, his body, as that is really what you'd have to call it at that point, was recovered. He had been tortured severely, his skin flayed, and his eyes plucked out. Gaunt was hours away from death at best had he continued to remain in Blood Pact captivity. Only the remarkable resilience of the Colonel Commissar had seen him last for as long as he already had. And in many ways, his ragged, bloodied form was a perfect representation of the entirety of the Tarnith regiment at the end of that action, which also saw the return of the hero of Herodor, Orgon Sorek, who had of course been handed into the hands of Imperial authorities after it was revealed that he was an unlicensed psyker.
He had been turned into a psychic weapon by the Imperium, who had tried to communicate with the Tarnith first and only, having been able to sense them with his vastly improved psychic powers. He had attempted to communicate with them, but had instead caused quite a bit of funny happenings. I will not tell you too much about it, because here's the thing. Only in Death is, in my opinion, probably the single best book in the entirety of the Gaunt's Ghost series, and I cannot recommend it enough, which is why I'm keeping it somewhat light on the details here. Ogun Sorik's service, torturous though it had long now been after his surrender, was finally ended on Yago by the bolt pistol of Commissar Hark, the very man who had condemned him to this existence in the first place. It was, of course, a by-the-book execution, as the now sanctioned Psyker Ogun Sorik had been acting above and beyond his official duties and remit. Anywho, after the action, the Colonel Commissar was reconstructed with all the arts and crafts of Imperial medicine. Van Voigt's personally coming to visit him in the hospital ward and assuring him that he would receive the finest prosthetic replacements for his eyes that had been plucked out by his captors. The Colonel Commissar was not exactly in a forgiving mood at the time, however, and Van Voigt apparently felt quite bad for the damage that he had indirectly inflicted on his friend and his regiment. And in all due likelihood, this was also the reason why the Tarnith and the Colonel Commissar were finally routed off the line and back into reserves, being sent back to Balhut, where it would be rested, relaxed, and reformed, and their commander, put back together again. It was long overdue, frankly, as the Tarnith had been on the line for 12 years, non-stop, with virtually no opportunity for recuperation. It was no doubt a great relief for the Colonel, and many of his men as well, that they would be finally given an opportunity to do so. Although, it did swiftly become clear that the Tarnith were, no garrison force. They started acting out, fairly quickly, actually. Disciplinary cases shot through the roof, and many, even including senior commanders, began plotting things to alleviate their boredom, to the point where Gaunt himself was beginning to pray to any power that would listen that their orders to return to the front line would arrive sooner rather than later, lest his regiment tear itself apart. Yeah. The Tarnith were not made to sit on their asses for extended periods of time, it seems. And an opportunity may very well be arriving, as after one of his daily sojourns at the Officers' Club on Balhut, Gaunt was waylaid on his way back to his billets by the Commissariat. Not in a bad way, mind you, but rather because they had a very special proposition, a mission for him. They had managed to capture what they believed to be a senior member of the Blood Pact, somebody who called himself Mabon Etogaur. Imperial intelligence had, of course, attempted to extract as much information from the man as possible, who had apparently surrendered himself into Imperial custody. But they had proven largely unsuccessful in, drawing anything at all from the man. He had proven remarkably, as in unusually, unnaturally resilient against any form of persuasion that the Imperium's interrogators could levy against him, be it physic or psychological torture or any other tool, be it drugs, chemicals, hallucination, manipulation, you name it, nothing was working. Now, the servants of the arch-enemy are often resistant to enhanced interrogation, because they've usually been through some shit themselves in their lives, and if it is indeed a legitimate possibility that the curse upon your soul, inscribed on your very spine, stating that if you betray your masters in any way, then a demonic monstrosity will gently but determinedly chew on your bone marrow for the next 5,000 years, well, that is ample motivation to keep shut. Although, in this case, it might not be quite that, as the prisoner had asked specifically for an Imperial officer, Ibrahim Gaunt of the Tarnith, first and only. And if he was just allowed to meet with the Imperial Commissar, then he would tell the Imperial interrogators anything and everything they wanted. Gaunt was, of course, immediately rather suspicious about this for multiple reasons. One, the man had not given them their name. Not quite. Mabon was probably at least part of his name, but Eto Gaur was his rank, the rough equivalent of a general or higher officer. Secondly, the Imperial intelligence officers had judged the man to be blood-packed, but this too was incorrect. Gaunt was able to deduce this by the fact that his hands were smooth, without a single blemish or ritual scar. The ritual scar that all Blood-Pact take when joining the pact. They cut their hands open on the Gaur's very own armor. That's the entire idea of the Blood Pact. And the fact that this man had now smooth and unblemished hands meant that either he had never been a blood pact at all, which seemed very unlikely, or that he had been blood pact but had received extensive surgery and or replacement hands to cover up the ritual scars. Now, we, of course, remember this Eto Gaur from a previous point in our story, on Geryon. This was the very self-same commander who had spoken to the traitor Imperial General, and had seemed very fascinated by the Imperium, by the Imperium's military, and by the Imperium's faith. Furthermore, Mabon had then been in the service not of the Gaur, but of the Anarch, as one of the individuals training his sons of Sek. So, technically, it would be more appropriate to say that this man was a son, rather than a member of the Blood Pact. But of course, he would still be a repository of incredible intelligence for the Imperium. There were many secrets hidden away within that head of his, to the point where Imperial intelligence was willing to bring in a third party from outside. Now, the Colonel Commissar was still a commissar, of course. It was not like they were pulling in some rando from the street, but Imperial intelligence tends to be very jealous when it comes to hoarding their resources and secrets, so this was a remarkable move from them. What was even more remarkable was the nature of the intelligence that the prisoner, as the Commissariat now called him, Prisoner B, was purporting to possess. After meeting, as he requested, with Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, Mabon stated that he had information that would allow the Imperium to win the war in the Sabbat worlds. That was a big promise, and explained largely why the Commissariat was taking such a large risk as to bring in somebody not directly associated with their intelligence gathering efforts in on this operation, even as they had kept others out of it. One of these others being Handro Rhyme, an Inquisitor, and one of many bringing a bad name to the Inquisitors in the Samad Worlds, but we'll get to that a fair bit later. The Commissariat had not seen fit to inform the Inquisition, or any other arm of Imperial intelligence, mind you, that they possessed Prisoner B, nor, of course, any details as to his capture or the potential secrets that he held within his skull. But if the Imperium was ever in any doubt as to the validity and the value of aforementioned secrets, then that doubt was soon to be dispelled, as a giant red monster slammed its way into the Commissariat headquarters on Balhut and started indiscriminately butchering everyone. As far as confirmations go, this was certainly a rather strident one, as it appears the archenemy had dispatched a special assassination team all the way to Balhut, guaranteeing their own demise, of course, by doing so, just to silence this guy. And it wasn't just the monster either, a so-called blood wolf, a ritual where a demon soul was bound into the body of a blood-packed soldier, turning him into a frenzied bestial creature, capable of enormous destruction in very short time before the entire thing would burn out and pop. It required, of course, the sacrifice of one of the members of the Blood-Pact Strike Team, their most devoted of all. The rest of the group would then follow in his wake and hopefully take charge of Prisoner B and killing him as quickly as they could, before then making a final stand against Imperial retaliation. Their plan, however, had not taken into account the presence of the Inquisitor, who had with him the tools to at least slow down the demonic creature, and the presence of Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt, who immediately took Prisoner B with him and effected an escape from the Commissariat. Unfortunately, Mabon had taken a round in the escape. He was severely wounded, and the Colonel Commissar had to find some way to treat him immediately. But he also had no idea who he could truly trust anymore. Clearly, the Blood-Pact Strike Team had known exactly where the Mabon was. This meant they had information from very deep within the Commissariat, or within some other form of Imperial intelligence. The Blood-Pact troop was also apparently tracking them, and Gaunt had no real idea why. He could try to make it back to the Tarnith barracks, but that was a long drive indeed, with a bleeding out Mabon in the back seat of a requisitioned vehicle. That was not a very good idea, and heading to a civilian medical facility was also going to be rather dangerous. Left with not a whole lot of options, however, he elected to go to a backstreet doctor, one Dr. Colding, or, well, doctor is perhaps a bit of a stretch, as he primarily handled, dead people, corpses, embalming procedures and so on, but hey, any port in a storm. And due to Mabon's remarkably resistant physiognomy, which, bearing in mind things we'll learn later, was still oddly weak, oh well, the Eto Gaur survived, and was able to reveal to Gaunt that the reason why the Blood Pact were able to track them so effectively was because they had a blood witch with them, a psyker specialized in the reading of blood and the tracking of anyone whose blood she possessed. And after the Eto Gaur had been wounded, she had his. Quite a bit of cat and mouse through the streets of Balhut followed, as somehow the witch psyker had managed to place a spell upon the city, causing the Imperium's response to be weirdly muted and dulled. It seemed impossible that a single psycho could have affected so much of the city so completely, but, well, there were other reasons for that as well, which we will get to in but a moment. Fortunately for the Colonel Commissar, a group of Tarnith, including dangerously high-ranking officers, had been out and about on a little bit of mischief. Robbing a local criminal gang's gambling enterprises. Yeah, the whole thing about the Tarnith not being a garrison force, that was, if anything, an understatement, as they had been actively causing a lot of trouble during their stay on the planet. But this turned out to be a blessing in disguise, as they were able to make contact with the rest of the Tarnith and eventually the Colonel Commissar. The Tarnith regiment had been prevented from deploying in large scale due to agents of Inquisitor Rhyme having arrived to oversee things, just in case the Colonel Commissar decided to reach out to them, because the Inquisition had now decided that it seemed awfully suspicious that Gaunt should effect an escape along with the prisoner and not immediately make contact with the Inquisition or the rest of the Imperium. Was he perhaps attempting to aid the prisoner in some way or some sort? Commissar Hark and Cadet Commissar Lud did not quite trust the Inquisitorial agents, though, and worked with their own solutions to try and get a hold of Gaunt, which they eventually succeeded in. This was when the Inquisitor showed his other side, arriving alongside many other Imperial forces and the Tarnith and the Blood Pact, resulting in a massive shootout, seeing the death of the rest of the Blood Pact infiltration unit. The Eto Gaur recognized the Inquisitor and named him Siko Magir, with Magir, of course, being a high rank within the Sons of Sek. This then goes quite some way to explain the dulled and muted response from the Imperial side. Not only were they being affected by the Blood Witch's magic, but the Inquisition had no doubt also put out a blanket restriction on the movement of Imperial troops, explaining that there was no need to fully mobilize the garrison or even activate PDF or local policing forces, that the Inquisition had everything well in hand. That hand being to recapture Prisoner B and either kill him or bring him back to the Archon for a little bit of re-education. I tell you, the Sabbat Worlds are just a breeding ground for terrible Inquisitors. Here we have a turncoat Inquisitor straight up for the cause of chaos, or worse even still, a chaos operative that somehow has managed to infiltrate the Inquisition, gaining a hold of apparently a legitimate Rosetta whilst doing so. And this after we had another Inquisitor fetishize the vile Xenos Eldar to the point of joining them. I don't know what's in the water over in the Sabbat Worlds, but it's clearly not good for the God Emperor's most devoted and holy of servants. Luckily, due to the efforts of the Colonel Commissar and his regiment, the traitor was dispatched alongside the Blood Pact, and the asset was saved. As for the nature of his information, well, it was a rather intriguing gambit that he presented, which would also become the next mission for the Tarnith First and Only, after it now having become very obvious to everyone involved that Tarnith were not going to sit happily on their asses without causing a lot of crime in the local area. It was necessary to get them somewhere else than a civilized center of commerce as quickly as possible. And the Eto Gaur presented just such an opportunity in an infiltration and destruction mission against a secret weapons research facility known as Salvation's Reach. A location that offered the opportunity to not just merely negatively impact the enemy's research efforts, but also an opportunity to drive a final wedge between Anakwana Sek and the Gaur. It was an extremely high-risk mission, deep behind enemy lines, with no guarantee whatsoever that the strike team would return. But, if successful, the payoff could be tremendous. And hey, the Tarnith were asking for a posting. Might as well accommodate their wishes. And as for the result of that operation, and the status of the wider front, we'll get to that again next week. Till then, thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day. Erevan to become a major and early speed bump for any prospective Imperial crusade. Yet not counted with, however, the sheer scale of the invading forces. A truly staggering amount of munitions was expended, but in return, the massed, dug-in Chaos batteries in and around Ferevan were destroyed in record time, buying the Archon no more than 3 measly weeks. Admittedly, at that time, when the Crusade's main strength moved on, the planet was not completely pacified, as large-scale resistance persisted in the cities of Tanash and Brulliance, along with continued skirmishes and guerrilla warfare that would go on for years. But within the first few days of the dawning year, all determined resistance and any real threat of a genuine counterstroke had been eliminated by second-line regiments. This relatively easy pace of advance, however, was never going to last, as the War Master's principal strength, the First Fleet, ran into its first true roadblock on the planet Formal Prime. The planet had already been identified by War Master Sladeau as a potentially stumbling block for the start of the Crusade. This is why he had directed his primary strength towards it, and for good reason. Formal Prime was an old, and by now mostly derelict, hive world. At some point in the expansive history of humanity, the planet must have been a bustling, planet-sized metropolis, as it had several massive hive structures dotting its surface. But over the millennia, time had not been kind to Formal Prime, and most of its hives, virtually all in fact, were now at best in a state of disrepair, and at worst in a state of outright rot and collapse. Many of the larger hive structures had even outright begun to sink into the planet's soft soil, creating vast and complex underhive structures with thousands of kilometers of tangled and barely, if even at all, mapped tunnels, millions of divergent paths, caves, long-locked highways, subterranean sinks and sewer complexes turned into living quarters, and cavernous underground spaces created by the collapse of dozens of hive floors. A convoluted mess of the highest order, which afforded the defender trillions of bolt holes in which to hide, and equally many paths through which to ambush advancing Imperial forces as they dug ever deeper into the crumbling monolithic structures. Already on the immediate face of it, on the theoretical planning tables and the countless papers scattered across the War Master's desk, this was clearly a grand challenge. And that was precisely why Sladeau had brought his first fleet here, the cream of the Imperium's crop, his greatest strength, to descend upon Formal Prime in hitherto unseen numbers. Slato estimated 6 weeks from the beginning of pacification's operations to the completion of compliance paperwork. This was to be a demonstration of the sledgehammer of the Imperium, of the crushing force of the Guard, and it was to be Slato's moral victory to steal the resolve of the Crusade as it plunged ever forward into the Sabbat worlds. It was a carefully chosen battleground, with a carefully chosen risk, with a carefully chosen reward. And against a conventional foe, the War Master may very well have been entirely correct. But Formal Prime was also the first instance in which the invading Imperial forces was to run into the true fanatical nature of the arch-enemy, as the principal opposition on Formal Prime was guided not by military commanders, but rather by a class of zealous priesthoods known as the Charismites. They were the first Imperial Guard rough equivalent formation that the Crusade had encountered. Up until now, they had fought rebels, local militia, and garrison forces. The Charismites, however, were the private army under the command of one of the Chaos Magisters, the essential equivalent of Imperial Guard Lord militants. In this case, the Charismites were under the inspired and highly zealous leadership of Shebol Redhand. Now again, whilst the War Master had always anticipated Formal Prime to be a serious challenge, being the largest and most populous and most important world attacked in the initial phase of the Crusade, he had not anticipated for it to be the first point of impact with the arch-enemy Archon's true forward line of defenses. The other planets were little more than a picket line defense, whilst Formal Prime was the first real bulwark. Thus, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 weeks came and went, and a 7th, and an 8th, and a 9th, and a 10th. By the 11th week, Slato was growing increasingly desperate. Not because he was in any clear danger of losing the war at this point. The war for Formal Hive was solidifying into an Imperial victory, but it was taking far too long. Again, this was intended to be the great symbolic early victory to raise the Imperium's morale. Instead, Formal Prime and its deep sub-hive sinks were turning into a blood-drenched quagmire. As at one point, as the Guard was burying itself ever deeper into the depths of Sangrel Hive in particular, one of the most fiercely contested locations on the world, it cost an average of 200 Imperial Guardsmen's lives to seize a single meter of terrain. This was unacceptable. There was so much more at stake here than the fate of a single world. The War Master's reputation was at stake, and with it, the integrity of the Crusade in total. The offensive to retake the Sabbat worlds had only been launched under the assumption that the Imperium had found a commander the equal of the Chaos Anarch that had stolen it from the Imperium in the first place. If that War Master was stumbling at the very first impediment, a lot of very powerful people would start asking some very pointed questions about the very baseline assumptions of the Crusade. Feeling the very ground shift beneath his feet, War Master Slato was understandably frustrated.
and on multiple occasions were reported as yelling at his staff, shouting at them, screaming even, demanding that someone do something. "Show me men who know how to fight," he was quoted as having said during one particularly fiery meeting. But for all the spirit of the Imperial Guard, this was simply not a war they could win quickly. Now, there were other resources at Slado's command, and it was the eventual deployment of one of these resources that finally broke the stalemate. The God Emperor's avenging angels, the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, would finish this fight. Companies of the White Scars were deployed down to the planet and its hives, Sangrel Hive in particular having become a locust of Karasmite resistance. And what the Imperial Guard had failed to do in 3 months, the Space Marines did in 3 days, shattering the Karasmite resistance, capturing their leaders, and crucifying them on the approaches to Sangrel Hive and every other major population center on the planet. The sons of Jagatai Khan had saved Slado's moral victory, albeit by the slimmest of margins, and had allowed the War Master to retain the confidence of his backers. But it had also forced him to play a card he was intending to keep in reserve until much later on in the crusade. Even just the simple fact, the information that there were Astartes forces in the crusade host, was invaluable information for the Anarch. And judging by the speed of the annihilation of the Karasmite forces in Sangrel Hive and surrounding areas, he could also get a decent estimate of their strength, their disposition, and probably their nature as well. Thus, despite Formal Prime, of course, being a solid Imperial victory, the first round of leader versus leader, of War Master versus Anarch, has to go to the Chaos Warlord. Not only had Nadzibar picked out the precise world against which the weight of the Imperial thrust would land, and ensure it to be as sticky and objective as possible in order to endanger Slado's moral victory, he had also forced the War Master to show far more of his hand than Slado was comfortable with. And despite the obvious strategic importance of a major hive world, Formal Prime was, at the end of the day, nothing more than a frontier world on the very leading edges of the Sabbat system. There is no doubt that in the eyes of the Anarch, the loss, or more correctly now in retrospect, the sacrifice of this world more than paid for itself. And Slado would have known that just as well as Nadzibar did. And the War Master's woes would not end there. The Fourth Fleet, the diversionary counterpunch under the command of Lord Militant Sibon, had been heading towards Indrid, and had been making good progress all the while as well, just like the Second and the Third Fleets had. But this turned out to quite possibly be another well-planned out trap on the arch-enemy's behalf, as after having been drawn thoroughly into the Sabbat worlds, the Fourth Fleet found itself under attack by rapid moving the Hedwak, arch-enemy fleet formations, coming from the systems of Melsar and Talesant. Operation Red Drake had not envisioned the enemy being able to move such significant naval reserves so quickly to such a far-flung area,
certainly not on any level that could possibly threaten the existence of the Fourth Fleet. And yet, Lord Militant Sibon found himself now in the very real danger of being cut off and attacked on two sides, crushed between the reinforcements coming into his rear and the objectives that still lay to his front. What Slado had intended as a diversionary maneuver had suddenly become a do-or-die scenario, both for Sibon and his Fourth Fleet, and also potentially for the Crusade at large. The loss of a principal formation like this, diversionary though it may be, would have inflicted serious damage on the Crusade's morale and its political foundations and backing in the wider Imperium. Fortunately, despite this now being the War Master's second grand strategy error, his eye for personnel and commanders had not failed him. Lord Militant Sibon had been the perfect choice for the Fourth Fleet. He was a man of initiative and independent thinking. Where other naval commanders might have panicked, finding themselves in a wholly unexpected situation, and with their only retreat route apparently being cut off by fast-moving enemy ships, they may very well have chosen to scatter, to flee, to try and break up the fleet formations in an effort to evade pursuit. They may even have turned around completely, hoping to break through the rapidly encircling forces and get away. In either scenario, the Imperial fleet would risk complete annihilation, either hunted down by countless smaller fleets who knew the warp lanes in the area far better than them, or in a pitched naval battle against a superior enemy force. But not Lord Militant Sibon. Thinking to himself that the enemy admiral must be feeling awfully confident right about now, he elected to play the part. The Fourth Fleet began to shatter and break up. Formations would first gather as if readying themselves for a major confrontation, and then, as if thinking the better of it, start to scatter out again, preparing to flee. Fast cruisers would rush ahead of capital ships, only for the capital ships to turn around, forcing the cruisers to rush back in desperate pursuit. Squadrons of escorts, destroyers, and frigates would simply be hanging about in empty space with nothing to guard. Meanwhile, major capital vessels and carriers would be floundering, completely exposed and unguarded. As the headwalk grew ever closer, even this mockery of discipline faltered yet further. Individual squadrons were running off to God Emperor alone knows where. Individual ships were separating themselves from their larger formations and fleeing head over heels. Command and control of the Fourth Fleet had simply ceased to exist, with each and every vessel acting on its own heedless accord. Fearful flight awarded the Imperials, if nothing else, wings, as they slipped past the two closing pincers of the headwalk formations. But smelling blood in the water, they lit warp engines to full and pursued the already broken foe, taking no heed of the fact that they were now leaving the Sabbat world system and venturing into an area in which they had no control and apparently precious little intelligence. Oh, they caught the Fourth Fleet, all right. They caught it near the planet of Colquis, a heavily defended Imperial Navy fortress world, where the Fourth Fleet now sat nestled under countless orbital gun batteries. Thus the hunter became the hunted. Lord Militant Sibon had pulled off a brilliant feigned retreat, drawn out the enemy's reinforcements, smashed them upon the batteries of Colquis, routed them, and now launched his pursuit straight back to his original target of Indrid, where a ferocious ground war soon developed. War Master Slado's diversionary action had most certainly succeeded, even if at the risk of the entirety of the Fourth Fleet. But there was to be no swift victory as a crowning achievement. The war on Indrid grew stale and stagnant, lasting well into the next year of 756, at which point Lord Militant Sibon, saying, "I am but Slado's man," authorized a orbital bombardment of the planet, which was still being fought over by Imperial Guard troops. It was a cold-blooded sacrifice, the likes of which even the enemy did not see coming. And it did succeed in wrapping up the war on Indrid, with the annihilation of the enemy's main strength formations, along with a not insignificant portion of Lord Militant Sibon's Imperial Guard troops as well. It was rumored that one of his finest generals, one Marshal Blackwood, later resigned from Sibon's service over this atrocity. But at least the crusade had now gotten unstuck, with Formal Prime overcome by Slado and Indrid conquered by the Fourth Fleet. The door had been most thoroughly kicked open, and the crusade proper could now commence. It behooves us then, therefore, to take a step back and look at Operation Red Drake, its successes and its failures. On the one hand, it was undisputably an Imperial victory, as the path forward into the Sabbat worlds now lay open. Equally indisputably, however, is the fact that the Anarch got the better end of the engagement on Formal Prime. By loosely holding the outlying worlds, the Anarch succeeded in making the Second and the Third Fleet strike out against virtually nothing, against air, whilst focusing his forces on Formal Prime in the easily defensible depths of its decrepit hive structures. He had successfully forced the crusade to pump the brakes and sink itself into a quagmire of the Anarch's design. It had also forced the War Master to reveal parts of his deck in an effort to loosen himself from it. And God Emperor be praised, that was the worst thing that happened. It seems now more and more obvious, trap laid out for the Imperials at the world of Indrid very nearly cost the Crusade the Fourth Fleet. Had it not been for the inspired leadership of Lord Militant Sibon, the Crusade may very well have lost a considerable portion of its strength within the first year of its commencement. And all for a strategically insignificant planet with no worth to anyone except as a distraction. An intent and a possibility that the Chaos Warlord had read perfectly. In the Imperial camp, meanwhile, War Master Slado was outwardly joyous and jubilant. Operation Red Drake had been a significant success. It had achieved all its principal objectives and could now march forward into the Sabbat worlds. Yes, it had been delayed, and Imperial intelligence revealed that large Chaos forces were now gathering on the worlds of Gothrone, Lucius, Hesketh, Kokiaminus, Fornax Aleph, Ambald 11, Ashek II, Melsar, and Taliskand.
But this was no more than anticipated. Of course, the enemy would react now that their front line had been so completely broken open. These were the enemy's hurried reinforcements, thrown into position to be brushed aside with brusque and ease. Sabbath worlds were a mere 10 years at most from being liberated. And Operation Newfound would be the salvation so long desired by all the people of the Saints' chosen sector. We'll see if reality is quite so kind, however, as the war will be over by Christmas, as seemingly always turned out to be a falsehood. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.
Unlimited social media and YouTube shorts from Voxy Mobile is fab. Check this out. And this.
Have you seen this?
Run out of iron.
Bit weird.
The fun never ends with unlimited social media on Voxy Mobile. Selected social apps in UK, TNCs apply.
Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbath Worlds Crusade, where things are beginning to heat up. Operation Red Drake had been an Imperial success, having seized all of its primary objectives, but it had perhaps cost a little bit more than Warmaster Slado had wished for it to. Not necessarily in men or materiel, but in information. And then there was Lord Militant Subons, and the diversionary fleet's close shave against the Headwork. A worrying indication of what might lie ahead for the Imperial Crusade. But Nadzibar was not the only commander capable of laying traps. Now that Operation Red Drake had completed, Operation Newfound was immediately in effect. And if one is able to see the war front on the grand strategy scale that Warmaster Slado was, one can immediately begin to appreciate the scale of the potential victory at hand. With the first, second, and third fleets having taken formal prime on Skard and Long Hayland, they had secured, in essence, a system-scale outflanking position, with Lord Militant Sibon's fourth fleet resting at Indrid. There was now an opportunity for the Imperial fleets to sweep down from the sector's northernmost edge, down towards Balhut, swinging back towards Indrid, thus cutting off the arch-enemy's lines of communications from such worlds as Ashek II, Gothrone, Heskett, Kokiamus, Fornax Alpha, and so on, all the way down to Indrid. If this Imperial offensive could be carried out with sufficient speed, vim, and vigor, then a dozen Chaos planets could be severed from the arch-enemy's domain and left to rot on the vine. Easy pickings for the Imperium to reduce at its leisure. And the linchpin in all of this would of course be Balhut. When that was seized, the trap was in all due likelihood closed on the forces of chaos. Unfortunately, however, the fact of the matter was, and as Slado was now rapidly coming to appreciate, that plans very rarely survived contact with the enemy. What had been envisaged as a scalpel's swift strike across an enemy's jugular turned horrifyingly so more and more into a hacking, grinding, tearing mess, as the slow drive southward resembled a scalpel less and less, and more a hacksaw,
as Slado was forced to reassess his estimates for the seizure of Balhut 37 times between the years 756 and 761. As near immediately, the northern pincer ran into several serious and crippling difficulties. First and foremost, the enemy had proven significantly more resilient on the ground than had been anticipated. Formal Prime had already been an example of that, and Ashek II was going to be a much, much worse one. And secondly, and thirdly, the Imperial intelligence had severely underestimated the capabilities of the arch-enemy's naval forces. The Vahedwak were expected to be nothing more than scattered piratical bands, and yet the rapid response to Lord Militant Sibon's push towards Indrid and its near-disastrous consequences had already served up early warning that the Vahedwak were far more organized, disciplined, and effective than the Imperium had ever anticipated. And their ability to engage the Imperial Navy in pitched, major naval battles was to be fully demonstrated in the triangular area between Gothrone, Helena, and Hisk. Operation Newfound had been based primarily off the assumption that the Imperial Navy would be able to reign supreme in the void, and would be able to move between the vast areas between Gothrone, Helena, and Hisk to cut in between the enemy's foremost line of defense and Balhut with ease, as it was assumed that the mere pirate raiders of the Vahedwak would not be able to stand up in open challenge to the Imperial Navy. This assumption proved disastrously misinformed, as the Vahedwak forces were able to engage the Imperial Navy in pitched naval battles no less than 8 times in the Gothrone, Helena, and Hisk triangle. The Imperial Navy's void superiority was not merely being challenged, it was being outright halted. And to add insult to injury, whilst the Imperial Navy's battle lines were engaged with the main strength of the Vahedwak naval forces, Chaos Raiders were slipping past the triangle and raiding the Imperium's own lines of communications. Lines that were still far from fully secure. Having already been stymied in the triangle, the Imperial Navy could make no further headway on Operation Newfoundland. Chaos Raiders were slipping through to harass the Imperials, and the foothold that Slado had created from Red Rake was still not fully cemented, as the planet Ashek II continued to offer stiff and costly resistance. First and foremost, then, Ashek II needed to be neutralized. But standing in opposition to this glorious goal was the first major field commander that the Imperium had so far encountered in the Sabbat worlds. Heritor Asphodel, one of Archon Nadzibar's closest lieutenants, and the Lord and Master of the Heritor College. The Heritor College being a vast research and technological organization within the Chaos Forces hailing from the Sanguinary Worlds. In essence, they formed a rough simulacrum of the Adeptus Mechanicus of the God Emperor's most blessed Imperium, in that they recovered long-lost technologies, they researched these technologies, and whenever possible, weaponized, implemented, and improved upon them. Furthermore, unlike the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Heritor's College were also more than willing to delve into matters of the occult and chaotic artifacts. As for their peculiar name, the Heritors College and Heritor Asphodel himself, with Heritor being the title, stemmed from their idea that it was their destiny to inherit the Imperium of Man, as they did not see the Imperium, or the Emperor in fact, as necessarily enemies of their own ideology or their own religion. They viewed them instead as tragically misguided brethren, and the Emperor as a traitorous prophet to the primordial truth, who could and would inevitably, eventually, be brought back into the light of the fore. Heritor Asphodel himself was also a brilliant battlefield commander, and a prolific tinkerer, shall we say. And perhaps more problematic still, were dark rumors that he, and perhaps a significant portion of his college, had once belonged to the machine cult of Mars. These rumors were obviously vehemently denied and suppressed by the Adeptus Mechanicus, but the rumors alone were damaging and dangerous, and so a high priority was put on the capture and subsequent virtuous and just execution of Heritor Asphodel. And the hive world of Ashek II appeared to present a premium opportunity to do just that. Early Imperial forces had invaded the planet in 756, but no serious progress was made against the hives and the endless
It's a ball,
tides
right?
of war machines employed by Heritor Asphodel until Marshal Blackwood was transferred from Indrid in protest. It would turn out to be
It's
the
incredible,
right
I see,
man for the right
absolutely.
job at the right time. Marshal Blackwood had already established that he was the kind of Imperial commander that actually gave a shit about the guardsmen under his command. And so he elected to cease his predecessor's plan of simply burrowing the hives of Ashek II beneath the corpses of his guardsmen, and instead took a step back to identify the problem of why the Imperial Guard had not made any advances. And a painfully obvious one, really. They had been thrown in against fortified positions, occupied not merely by cultists or heretics, but by the Heritors' mad inventions. Thousands upon thousands of lethal, mad war machines that could only truly be described as products of the twisted imagination of a sadistic child.
takes
Behemoth
300.
tanks with spiked treads, bouncing wheels of
But there
flaying
should be
knives
350,
and
right?
chain, weapons that tore men apart, limb from limb, energized nets
Yeah, it's
intended to
360.
tighten upon a target, crushing them into a pulp until
Oh,
their
this
blood oozed out from between the wires. Such a foe would not be defeated by the Imperial Guardsman alone. For whilst he is the backbone of any Imperial crusade, he is but a man of soft and malleable flesh. And as Marshal Blackwood himself noted in his memoirs, these machines of the enemy are fashioned simply to strip and rend and break those mortal substances quite utterly.
It doesn't cover it.
Thus,
Oh.
if any true
I need
progress
to
was
move
to
it
be made,
one back.
Imperial armor would need to be deployed to face off against heretical steel. And so it was. Marshal Blackwood's action on Indrid had drawn the attention of War Master Sladen, who clearly approved of the Marshal's honorable bearing. And so 3 brigades of armor was dispatched to aid his guardsmen on Ashek II, including the Mershan 45th and the 2nd Narmenian Heavy. These desperately required tank reinforcements did much to stabilize the situation, but it was not enough in and of itself to reverse it, as, frankly, at this point, understandably so, the average Imperial Guardsman had had more than enough of being torn apart by the nightmare machines of the enemy. In fact, if Marshal Blackwood hadn't arrived when he did, and hadn't gotten the tanks when he did, there is every chance that the Imperial Guard forces on Ashek II might simply have outright broken, as the enemy's machines tore away at far more than just flesh, but also the spirits and the morale of the men. And whilst the arrival of the armor, the Narmenian heavies in particular, did much to restore the soldiers' spirits, it was nowhere near enough to launch proper offensive operations. And seeing as the enemy apparently had an infinite supply of their own woe machines, a term that now started to appear more and more frequently in Imperial reports describing the non-standard armor of the enemy, there seemed to be no hope of any actual progress on Ashek II. This remained the case until the Adeptus Mechanicus volunteered to dispatch a full squadron of Titans, including the Emperor-class Imperius Corporalis. This undoubtedly took Marshal Blackwood by surprise, as this sudden charitability was quite out of character for the Adeptus Mechanicus' behavior so far in the campaign. The Adepts of Mars had refused to deploy their prized war machines in any previous engagement, arguing, churlishly perhaps, yet still soundly, that their ancient god machines should not
How
be
the fuck it
risked
goes
on
through?
opening skirmishes, but should instead be spared and hoarded for the assault on the enemy's main
It's
positions.
still way too close.
And Ashek II was, of course, not numbered amongst them. Now, what precisely inspired
Even the laser
this
goes through. What
sudden
the fuck?
change of priorities is unclear. The Mechanicus, of course, maintained that they simply saw a need for their assistance, and so, as the dutiful servants of the God Emperor that they are, moved to provide it. Others might suggest that this had more to do with the further involvement of the War Master instead, as it is well known that he had gone to significant diplomatic lengths to secure the support of the Adeptus Mechanicus in the first place, and had been quite frustrated by their refusal to take part in any operations up until this point. It is entirely likely that he had used his vast diplomatic acumen to secure their final entry into the war, and Ashek II would have provided him with a fantastic argument for them to do so: the presence, of course, of Heritor Asphodel, whom, as we mentioned previously, dark rumors suggested that he had once been linked to the Adeptus Mechanicus. One need not be blessed with gregariousness the equal of the War Master to see how this might easily be turned into a very persuasive point indeed for why the Mechanicus should march to war now, both to see an opportunity to capture a potential traitor, according to some dark sources, and also an excellent opportunity for the Mechanicus to completely and utterly crush any lingering rumors that there were any sympathies that remained between themselves and the Heritor. Whatever the truth of the matter, the facts remained. The god machines walked. The Heritor's toys broke. And the hives of Ashek II trembled and fell beneath the blows of steel gods. as the hives were torched one by one by the combined firepower of all the deployed Titans, coining yet another term for the campaign, Burning Ladders to Hell, which would continue to be used to describe hive cities on fire from the very fundaments to the very highest level. Unfortunately, whilst Ashek too was now being slowly but surely secured, the true price, Heritor Asphodel, managed to escape the raging battles, as the Imperial Navy had still not managed to enforce a properly airtight blockade of the areas of operation. As the Imperial Navy's misfortune appeared to have no end. At least the Imperial Guard had finally managed to secure their objective, but at the naval station of Hesket, Chaos Raiders happened across an Imperial Navy flotilla at high anchor, and assaulted it with precious little forewarning, destroying 3 ships, including a cruiser, the Lord Falchion, and escaping with virtually no casualties or damage done to the raiders. These raiders were often made up of previous Vahedwak fleet formations that had been shattered during the opening days of Operation Newfoundland. Now finding themselves cut off from the bulk of the Chaos forces, these ships and minute flotillas now had no choice but to turn into opportunistic raiders. In most scenarios, they would have splintered and degraded into individual warships, fleeing for safety and succor wherever they could find it. But the advantage of Chaos's highly unorthodox command structure is now brought to the fore. The Vahedwak fleet had always been a raiding fleet, had always been piratical in nature, being separated from central command and control, really, was no big drawback to them whatsoever. They simply returned to their roots, attacking vulnerable targets to stave off their own, now inevitable, demise, be it due to running out of fuel, energy, food, or any of the other myriad things that a space-going warship requires. But whilst they were wilting on the vine, they were clearly intent on making the Imperium suffer just as much as they did. And so whilst the initial plan was to simply leave these piratical elements to picket formations, second and third line ships, it was now determined that a more organized effort needed to be made. And so in year 757, after the disaster at Hesket, Lord Militant Deliani was given the task of clearing out the raiding elements behind the Imperial lines. A seemingly unending and impossible task, as it was like, well, finding the metaphorical needle in the haystack. Except this haystack was a few billion miles wide. But once more, Warmaster Slado's gift for picking the right man for the job shone through, as instead of attempting to micromanage operations and enforce his own plans upon his sub-commanders, the Lord Militant Deliani conferred with the captains and the pirate hunters that had already been operating in the sector for now the better part of a year. They had first-hand experience with the nature of the Vahedwak ships. They knew where they headed. They knew where they liked to strike out against Imperial shipping. And by taking all of this information into the grandiose information massaging systems of the Imperial Navy, patterns soon began emerging.
Oh my god.
And bore almost instantaneous fruit.
Oh my god.
As a Chaos